One of these dictators once called a meeting with his entire political leadership, then calmly began reading a list of names of supposed traitors, ordering their arrest while the rest of the room was forced to watch, knowing that any reaction, even visible fear, could make them the next name on that list, turning a government meeting into a demonstration of absolute psychological control. Another ordered the destruction of a rebellious city with such overwhelming military force that thousands died, not only to stop an uprising, but to create a permanent lesson, a warning designed to echo across generations, making sure that the cost of resistance would always feel greater than the cost of obedience. And one of them, when faced with the possibility of losing power, would make decisions that helped push his own country into one of the most devastating conflicts of the modern era, proving that for some rulers, maintaining control was not just about leadership, but about survival, legacy, and the fear of what would happen if they ever lost their grip on power. These were not isolated events, and they were not the result of chaos alone. They were the product of carefully constructed systems of control, built over years through intelligence networks, political purges, loyalty tests, and an understanding that the greatest threat to an authoritarian ruler is not always the public, but often the people closest to him. The second half of the 20th century created the perfect conditions for these kinds of regimes to emerge across parts of the Arab world. As former colonies struggled to define themselves, militaries gained political influence, and strongmen presented themselves as the only figures capable of preventing instability, foreign interference, or national collapse. Many of these leaders did not initially present themselves as dictators. They presented themselves as protectors, reformers, or revolutionaries promising national pride, economic strength, and independence from outside influence. But over time, those promises often transformed into centralized systems where power flowed upward. Accountability disappeared, and opposition became increasingly dangerous. What made some of these regimes particularly durable was not just brutality, but organization, because the most effective authoritarian systems are rarely chaotic. They are structured, layered, and built with redundancy, meaning that even if one part fails, another continues functioning, making the regime far harder to dismantle than outsiders often assume. Security agencies became states within the state. Informant networks created cultures of silence, and political survival often depended not on competence, but on loyalty, creating environments where trust became rare and where even high-ranking officials understood they were never completely safe. In this video, we are going to examine four of the most ruthless Arab dictators of modern history by understanding not only what they did, but how they did it, because the real story behind authoritarian power is rarely just violence. It is calculation, patience, and the ability to turn institutions into personal instruments of control. We will begin with Saddam Hussein, a man whose rise from a modest background to the absolute ruler of Iraq was not accidental, but the result of years of political maneuvering, internal party struggles, and a deep understanding of how fear could be used, not only to eliminate enemies, but to prevent them from ever forming in the first place. His rule would become defined by internal purges, external wars and leadership style that combined charisma with calculated intimidation, creating an environment where loyalty was constantly tested and where even his closest circle understood that proximity to power also meant proximity to danger. From there, we will move to Muammar Gaddafi, whose revolutionary image and unconventional political philosophy masked a regime built on unpredictability, ideological control, and a system where the line between the state and the personal authority of the leader often disappeared completely. We will also explore how Hafez al-Assad transformed Syria into one of the most tightly controlled political systems in the region, building a structure designed not just to rule, but to endure, ensuring that the regime would survive challenges that might have collapsed less disciplined governments. And finally, we will examine Bashar al-Assad, whose leadership during one of the most complex conflicts of the 21st century would show how modern authoritarian power adapts under pressure, using both old methods of control and new geopolitical realities to remain in place. Because understanding these men is not about fascination with power alone. It is about understanding a recurring historical pattern, one that shows how certain leaders manage to transform fragile political moments into decades of personal rule. And to understand how that happens, we have to start at the moment when one man decided he would no longer just participate in power, he would control it completely. And that man was Saddam Hussein. When Saddam Hussein officially became president of Iraq in 1979, the transition did not look like a violent takeover from the outside. There were no tanks in the streets and no dramatic announcements of revolution. But behind closed doors, what happened in the following days would become one of the most infamous consolidations of power in modern political history. Shortly after assuming power, Saddam organized a high-level Ba'ath Party meeting that would later become one of the most studied examples of political intimidation ever recorded. A gathering where he announced that a conspiracy existed within the party, then began identifying supposed traitors one by one, while the entire event was filmed to serve as a permanent warning to anyone who might consider betrayal. As the names were read, security forces entered the room and removed those accused, while the remaining officials were forced to applaud. Not out of loyalty, but out of fear, because in that moment everyone understood the real message. This was not just about removing rivals. It was about demonstrating that Saddam knew everything, saw everything, and could reach anyone. Many of those arrested would later be executed, and even more revealing was what happened next, as Saddam ordered some of the remaining party members to participate in the executions themselves, forcing them to prove their loyalty in a way that permanently tied their survival to his regime. A psychological strategy designed to eliminate not just opposition, but the possibility of future dissent. This moment would define Saddam's leadership style, because unlike rulers who depended purely on force, he understood that fear worked best when it was personal, unpredictable, and visible, creating a political climate where uncertainty became a weapon as powerful as any army. But Saddam's control did not come only from fear. It also came from his ability to build a deeply layered security structure, composed of multiple intelligence agencies that often monitored each other as much as they monitored the population, ensuring that no single institution could become strong enough to challenge him. These organizations operated extensive surveillance networks, recruited informants across different sectors of society, and developed reputations for ruthless efficiency, which meant that even rumors of opposition could trigger investigations, arrests, or disappearances, reinforcing the idea that resistance was not only dangerous, but almost certainly doomed. At the same time, Saddam carefully built his public image as a strong nationalist leader, investing in infrastructure projects, expanding parts of Iraq's economy during the oil boom, and presenting himself as the figure responsible for restoring Iraqi pride. Understanding that fear alone was not enough, people also needed a reason to accept his rule. This combination of development and repression created a dual reality inside Iraq, where some citizens experienced modernization and state investment, while others lived under constant threat, a contrast that helped maintain control because it divided perception, making the regime appear both beneficial and terrifying depending on who you were. His ambitions, however, were not limited to internal power, because Saddam also sought to position Iraq as a dominant regional force, a goal that would eventually lead him into one of the longest and most devastating conflicts of the late 20th century, the Iran-Iraq War, a conflict that lasted 8 years and reshaped the country's military and political structure. The war allowed Saddam to further justify internal control measures under the justification of national security, expanding repression while presenting himself as the defender of Iraq against external threats, a narrative frequently used by authoritarian governments to strengthen internal unity while weakening criticism. Later, his decision to invade Kuwait in 1990 would trigger international intervention and the Gulf War, dramatically changing Iraq's global position and leading 2 years of sanctions that would severely impact the Iraqi population, even as Saddam managed to remain in power despite global pressure. What made Saddam particularly resilient politically was his ability to survive moments that might have ended other regimes, adapting his strategies, tightening internal control when necessary, and maintaining elite loyalty through a combination of privilege, fear, and strategic appointments. By the time his rule ended in 2003, following the United States-led invasion of Iraq, Saddam Hussein had spent more than 2 decades demonstrating how authoritarian power could be maintained through a combination of calculated violence, institutional control, propaganda, and a constant awareness that the greatest danger to a dictator often comes from inside his own system. His fall would mark the end of his personal rule, but it would also open a new and unstable chapter in Iraq's history, raising an important question that history often forces us to confront. What happens when a system built entirely around one man suddenly disappears? Because the answer to that question would shape Iraq for years to come. If Saddam Hussein ruled through calculated fear and rigid control, Muammar Gaddafi ruled through something far less predictable, a system built not only on repression, but also on personal ideology, constant reinvention, and a style of leadership that made both his enemies and his allies unsure of what he might do next. When Gaddafi took power in 1969 through a military coup that overthrew the Libyan monarchy, he presented himself not as a traditional dictator, but as a revolutionary figure who wanted to eliminate corruption, remove foreign influence, and redistribute Libya's oil wealth to its population, positioning himself as a symbol of Arab nationalism and anti-imperial resistance. But what made his rule unusual was how he structured power after taking control, because instead of building a conventional government structure, Gaddafi created what he called the Jamahiriya, or state of the masses, a political system that officially claimed to eliminate traditional government in favor of direct rule by the people, while in reality consolidating ultimate authority around himself. He promoted his political philosophy through his famous Green Book, a text where he outlined his views on politics, economics, and society, presenting what he claimed was a third alternative between capitalism and communism. But in practice, this ideology functioned as a justification for dismantling institutional checks on his authority. Under this system, formal titles often meant less than personal loyalty, and real power frequently operated through informal revolutionary committees and security structures that ensured that any emerging opposition could be quickly identified and neutralized, often before it could become organized. Gaddafi also developed a reputation for dealing harshly with dissent, particularly during periods when his regime felt threatened, supporting internal purges and authorizing actions against political opponents both inside and outside Libya, reinforcing the message that distance did not guarantee safety from his reach. At the same time, he invested heavily in social programs funded by Libya's oil revenues, improving access to housing, education, and healthcare for many citizens, creating another example of the dual reality often present in long-lasting authoritarian regimes, where material improvements exist alongside severe political restrictions. What made Gaddafi especially difficult to challenge was his ability to constantly change the rules of the political game, restructuring institutions, rotating officials, and keeping potential rivals uncertain about their own positions, ensuring that no stable alternative power base could easily form. His international behavior also contributed to his controversial legacy, as Libya became associated with various geopolitical conflicts and accusations of supporting militant movements during the Cold War era, increasing his isolation on the global stage while strengthening his image among certain groups as a defiant anti-Western figure. However, the same unpredictability that helped him maintain power for decades would eventually become a weakness when the Arab Spring protests reached Libya in 2011, as demonstrations calling for political change quickly escalated into armed conflict, after the regime chose confrontation rather than compromise. As the conflict intensified, Libya descended into civil war, drawing international attention and eventually military intervention, leading to the collapse of Gaddafi's government after more than 40 years in power, one of the longest continuous rules in modern Middle Eastern and North African history. His final days would become symbolic of the risks faced by rulers who build systems centered almost entirely on personal authority. Because once the structure around him began to collapse, there were few stable institutions capable of preserving the state in an orderly transition. Gaddafi's fall did not just end a government. It also left behind a fragmented political landscape that Libya continues to struggle with, showing once again a recurring historical pattern that when power is too concentrated in one individual, its sudden removal can leave behind a dangerous vacuum. And yet, while Gaddafi ruled through unpredictability and revolutionary image, the next leader built something even more structurally durable. A system designed not just to rule Syria, but to survive any threat against it. And that system began with Hafez al-Assad. If Gaddafi built a regime around ideology and unpredictability, Hafez al-Assad built something far more methodical, a system designed with one primary objective: to ensure that what happened to other Arab leaders who lost power would never happen to him. When Hafez al-Assad took control of Syria in 1970 through what became known as the corrective movement, he did not simply remove rivals. He began restructuring the entire political and military hierarchy to ensure that loyalty would always outweigh ambition, and that potential challengers would never be able to coordinate against him. Unlike leaders who ruled through constant dramatic displays of power, Assad ruled through quiet structural dominance, placing trusted allies, often from his own Alawite background and loyal military networks, into critical positions across intelligence agencies, elite military units, and internal security organizations. This was not done randomly. It was done with a long-term survival strategy in mind. because Assad understood something many dictators learned too late, that coups rarely come from the streets. They come from inside the system, from generals, intelligence chiefs, and political insiders who believe they can take control. To prevent this, he created overlapping security agencies with competing responsibilities, ensuring that they monitored not only the population, but each other, creating an environment where conspiracy became extremely difficult because trust between power centers was deliberately limited. But the defining moment that would permanently shape his legacy came in 1982, in the city of Hama, when an uprising linked to the Muslim Brotherhood challenged government authority, triggering a response that would become one of the most controversial crackdowns in modern Middle Eastern history. Government forces surrounded the city and launched a massive military operation to eliminate the insurgency, using artillery and ground forces in a campaign that demonstrated the regime's willingness to use overwhelming force to re-establish control, sending a message not only to insurgents, but to the entire country about the consequences of organized rebellion. The scale of the operation remains heavily debated by historians. But what is not debated is the political effect. After Hama, large-scale internal armed opposition inside Syria became far less common for decades, showing how decisive and controversial demonstrations of force can reshape political behavior through deterrence. Assad would continue ruling Syria until his death in 2000, leaving behind not just a government, but a fully structured power system designed to survive leadership transition, something many authoritarian regimes fail to achieve. And this is where the story takes a different turn, because instead of the regime collapsing after his death, power transferred to his son, Bashar al-Assad, a transition that would test whether a system built by a military strongman could survive under a very different kind of leader. Bashar was not originally expected to rule. He had trained as an ophthalmologist and spent years outside the political spotlight, only becoming the clear successor after the death of his older brother Basil, who had been groomed for leadership. When Bashar took power, many observers initially believed Syria might move toward gradual reform, as he projected a more modern image and spoke about modernization and technological development, raising cautious hopes that the rigid structures built by his father might slowly open. But history would take a different direction in 2011, when protests inspired by the Arab Spring began appearing in Syria, initially driven by demands for reforms, anti-corruption measures, and political change, movements that in other countries sometimes led to leadership transitions. Instead, Syria became one of the most complex and devastating examples of how authoritarian systems react under existential pressure. As protests escalated, repression intensified, and the situation evolved into a multi-sided civil war involving internal factions, regional actors, and global powers. The conflict would reshape Syria, creating one of the largest humanitarian crises of the century, displacing millions and transforming entire cities into battle zones, while Assad's government relied on its military structure, foreign alliances, and internal security networks to avoid collapse. What Bashar al-Assad demonstrated was not just the brutality often associated with civil conflict, but the durability of systems built over decades, showing how Institutions designed for regime survival can continue functioning even under extreme pressure. When we look at Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, Hafez al-Assad, and Bashar al-Assad together, a clear pattern begins to emerge. One that goes far beyond individual personalities. Because while their styles were different, their survival strategies often followed the same underlying logic. And that pattern leads us directly to the final and most important conclusion of this entire story. When we look at the stories of Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, Hafez al-Assad, and Bashar al-Assad together, what becomes clear is that despite their different personalities, different countries, and different historical moments, they all followed the same unwritten rule of authoritarian survival. They understood that power is rarely lost because people are unhappy. Power is usually lost when elites stop being afraid. Each of these rulers invested enormous effort not just in controlling the population, but in controlling the people closest to power. The generals, intelligence chiefs, political insiders, and economic figures who historically have the real capacity to remove a leader. Saddam Hussein prevented internal coups by making loyalty a matter of life and death, creating an environment where even potential conspirators could never be sure who might betray them first. Gaddafi prevented stable opposition by constantly reshaping his own system, making sure that nobody could build a predictable path to challenge him. Hafez al-Assad prevented regime collapse by building institutions designed to survive crises, not just govern during stability. And Bashar al-Assad demonstrated how those same structures could continue functioning even under the extreme pressure of modern conflict. What connects them is not simply repression. It is the architecture of control. Because the most durable dictators do not just react to threats. They build systems where threats struggle to even form. History shows us something uncomfortable but consistent. Authoritarian regimes rarely survive for decades because of brutality alone. They survive because they combine fear with structure, repression with organization, and control with patience. And this leads to a final historical rule that appears again and again across different countries and different eras. Dictators do not last because they are the strongest men in the room. They last because they build systems where nobody else can become strong enough to replace them. But there is also another pattern that history quietly reveals. No matter how strong these systems appear, none of them last forever. Some collapse through foreign intervention. Some collapse through internal fracture. Some collapse through slow erosion after the ruler is gone. But they always end. And when they do, nations are often left dealing not only with the legacy of the leader, but with the consequences of systems that were never designed to function without them. This is why studying these figures is not about fascination with authoritarian power. It is about understanding how fragile political systems can become when too much control is concentrated for too long, and how difficult it can be to rebuild once fear becomes part of the institutional foundation of a country. Because in the end, the real lesson left behind by these rulers is not just about how dictators rise. It is about how systems allow them to stay, and why history keeps repeating this pattern